Now to our conversation with one reporter who went undercover in order to infiltrate some of the same white nationalist groups that at one point targeted her. Over the course of a year and a half, Talia Lavin assumed several identities and burner accounts and eventually gained access into some of the messaging boards and even dating sites used by white supremacists. Her decision to go undercover came after a tweet that she posted about ICE went viral online. At the time, she was working for The New Yorker, but became the target of such vicious anti-Semitic attacks that she ultimately decided to quit her job. Talia Lavin details her remarkable reporting in her new book, Culture Warlords: My Journey into the Dark Web of White Supremacy, and she joins us now from Brooklyn, New York. So I got to tell you, I mean, this sort of blew my mind. Vlad and I have occasionally talked about, the kind of abuse that you subject yourself to when you're in the media and you're also on social media. It is, you're particularly vulnerable when you're a woman because there's a lot of misogyny out there. And man, you took some serious heat and you sort of turned that into fuel for this book. So as I pointed out, you took on a myriad of different online personalities and characters to infiltrate these various sort of messaging boards, but you also went online on like a white supremacy dating site. Can you talk to us a little bit about Operation Ashland?
Yeah, that's what the chapter in the book is called. I spent about a year undercover on a white supremacist dating site called whitedate.net, which was sort of explicitly advertised to racists. I talked to all kinds of white men looking for their trad wife, the sort of submissive Aryan woman who would continue the white race with them, and looking for kind of a chaste, submissive woman to breed the next generation of white supremacists in her womb. And I wound up asking them to write me love letters to their ideal white wife, which I include in the book, and which are sort of a car crash between Nicholas Sparks and Mein Kampf. And
oh my gosh.
Wow.
What really struck me was, contrary to some popular ideas about what white supremacists are and, how they look or what they might do, there were people from all walks of life and all levels of education and all geographic regions of the U.S., California, New York, and everywhere in between. Members of the military, there were a ton. I spoke to an assistant professor in Zurich, Switzerland, undercover. And so I really think that helped me sort of explode the stereotype that all white supremacists are sort of uniquely poor or traumatized, disenfranchised, undereducated, like that, you can only be led to this sort of toxic hatred if you faced a uniquely difficult life. And I just have not found that to be the case.
It is an interesting point because when those narratives are discussed or when they're written about, I don't know, maybe it's because I'm a person of color, but I'm always like, I've not found that to be the case, that people who have white supremacist notions are poor or uneducated. In fact, I find that sometimes to be quite the opposite, as you have discovered through your research and your reporting. And on the white date platform you engage with guys from all over America, and you wrote this: the sheer geographic variation was a powerful argument against any notion that white supremacy is confined to the American South or even to red states. But did any of them propose or seem to plan any kind of real-life violence in their interactions with you?
So many of so not in the moments where they were trying to seduce my alter ego. They didn't really lead with any specific terror plots. In the groups that I was sort of joining under all kinds of different personas or just eavesdropping on, more general white supremacist chat rooms, there were certainly ambient discussions of violence. There was lionization of violence. In fact, there was a consistent referral to people who had committed acts of white supremacist violence, like Dylan Roof, like Anders Breivik, the man who killed 77 people in Norway, the neo-Nazi, as saints. There was this lionization of violence and what I would call an environment of stochastic terror, which is sort of an ambient environment that encourages violence. I wasn't privy to sort of specific discussions of let's go blow up X, but the ambient environment that was present and the conversations that I listened to were sort of persistent, like a perpetual motion machine of encouragement towards violence, towards hate, and towards enacting that hate through acts of racially inspired, religiously inspired violence. So it
I'm
was
glad
really
you brought up the sort of. You brought up something interesting that I want to ask you.
It's tough sometimes.
Sorry, it's the whole modern technology. It's so flawless. But you brought up something interesting that I wanted to touch on. I was going to ask you about anti-Semitism because it sort of seems to be the backbone of the movement. And even though we've seen, black churches being attacked, anti-Semitism seems to sort of run through it all. But also, I wondered if you also noticed, and why, if you also noticed misogyny, if you also noticed this narrative around being a good Christian, just how sort of anti-Semitism, misogyny, Christianity, how they kind of like build that argument to justify their point, their worldview.
Yeah, giving me the simple question. So no, I think, so first of all, I want to start by saying anti-blackness is the lock, stock, and barrel of the white power movement in the U.S. It's the absolute sort of background noise, the thread. I mean, I saw people trading photos of lynchings and laughing at them. So anti-blackness is absolutely at the center. The function that anti-Semitism serves, and I saw it ubiquitously, and have experienced, the ways that people engage in anti-Semitic rhetoric myself against me. Anti-Semitism serves as more the intellectual linchpin of the movement. It's sort of the sine qua non of the white supremacist viewpoint. It sort of serves as this function where white men get to speak about the Jew, the eternal Jew, as this omnipresent, all-powerful foe controlling the levers of power, and that they are thus sort of oppressed and righteous fighters against a more powerful foe. It's a means to sort of justify themselves as courageous and oppressed and righteous, is by evoking this specter of the all-powerful Jew. And that does come from, centuries, millennia of Christian anti-Semitism. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was produced in 1903, and it's still a very popular text. You had Henry Ford right here in the U.S. producing The International Jew and republishing the Protocols in Detroit in ways that actually inspired Hitler and earned him the Order of the German Eagle. So, this idea of eliminationist anti-Semitism, the idea of the Jew as sort of this racialized oppressor who's all-powerful and in control and who you must fight, kind of the reason behind every social ill, from literally from people being gay or trans, that's a Jewish plot, to basically anything you dislike in the modern world can be pinned on the Jew. And so the Jew is a very useful rhetorical foil for white supremacists and a means to explain away every aspect of the modern world that its members might find oppressive or want to eliminate. I do want to answer your question on misogyny as well. I think this is something that's overlooked a lot in explorations of the movement, is just the absolute centrality of misogyny to the contemporary white power movement. And that manifests in two ways, major ways that I explore in the book. One is that misogyny and misogynistic sort of YouTube videos, propaganda, really form an entry point for a lot of people into the movement. These sort of anti-feminist, slickly produced videos offer people, people who are angry, an acceptable class of people to hate and to harass, to wit, feminists, and offer people an explanation of how a socially progressive doctrine, to wit, feminism, is making their lives miserable and just not what they want them to be. And so once you've established this prior situation where, yes, there's an acceptable class of people to hate and harass, and yes, and you should act on that hatred, and you should harass people, and this sort of conventional wisdom or this broadly accepted progressive social doctrine is the cause of all your troubles. It's a very short slope from there to say, well, what about Black people, and what about Jews, and what about immigrants? It really greases the slope for people. And then the other aspect is that, as we see with the Proud Boys, as we see with all sorts of white supremacist groups, and as I noted, undercover as a white supremacist babe on an all-white dating site, they really hew towards antiquated gender norms where a woman is a womb and a womb is a woman, and so they consequently really loathe and despise female sexuality, female sexual freedom, and reproductive autonomy. And these are really, really key to the white supremacist, movement writ large, whose sort of broad slogan is, we must preserve a future for ourselves, a secure future for ourselves and for our white children. That's the 14 words, a really popular and endemic white supremacist slogan coined by David Lane, a white supremacist terrorist who wrote those words in prison after shooting a Jewish radio host.
Talia, as you know, President Trump has been accused by some of enabling white supremacists or sending out dog whistles to them. I'm curious, in your reporting and in your research and interacting with some of these groups, how is President Trump viewed in these online environments by these groups that you infiltrated?
So it's a complicated question. I think at this point it's much less of a dog whistle and a lot more like a foghorn. When you have statements as, sort of unambiguous as stand back and stand by, to a well-known extremist, street fighting gang like the Proud Boys. That being said, so there were two phenomena that I observed. One was around the 2016 election. Trump's campaign was largely a campaign about and on white nationalism. It was about ridding the country of immigrants. It was about scapegoating Muslims for all the nation's ills. And that was a massive shot in the arm, a huge dump of adrenaline into the white power movement. There was a tremendous sense of exultation in his victory. There were tons of new groups formed. It was a giant recruitment drive for the white nationalist movement. That said, subsequently, these are extremists. They're difficult to satisfy. What they've sort of found is that while Trump has, to a very great degree, co-opted the Republican Party and reformed it in his own image, some of that reforming was mutual. Many ways in which Trump governs are sort of, in some ways, conventionally conservative or satisfying conservative priorities. He also has Jews in his cabinet. He has a Jewish son-in-law and Jewish grandkids. And while he uses that as sort of a defense, or members of his administration use that as a defense against, like, how could he be, encouraging Nazis when he has Jews in his orbit? I find that less convincing, but certainly the extremists that I spoke to were like, oh, he gave his white daughter away to a Jew, the White House is the Jew house, and, the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, which was largely to satisfy evangelical Christians, was viewed as sort of a great betrayal to the white nationalist cause. So there's been something of a disillusionment with Trump himself over the past, over his time in government. And so the consequences of that are a move away from electoralism, this idea that like we as white nationalists, as white power, movementarians are going to achieve our goals through the mechanisms of elected office, and towards accelerationism, which is the doctrine that essentially let's hasten civilizational collapse through violence, and then we can achieve our desired goal of a white ethno-state, ethnically cleansed of Jews and minorities. And so that's where you see a lot of the danger, a lot of the potential for violence coming is through this idea of hastening collapse, particularly at this precarious moment when civic passions are quite high and when Trump is, from his bully pulpit, encouraging violence in not so many words, directing people to watch the polls at armyfortrump.com. If you already have an encouragement from the highest office in the land to go surveil polling places, perhaps armed, that really is an environment ripe for civic strife and civic strife that white power movementarians are eager to exploit in order to usher in collapse.
Listen, I'll tell you, I could not have done what you did without probably being super disappointed in humanity. Probably every time I walked out on the street, I would be looking at people's faces wondering, are you one of those people, behind this pseudonym on this website? I'm wondering about just the psychological impact of immersing yourself in this sort of environment. How are you feeling? How are you doing?
Well, I think there are things worth sacrificing your mental health for. I think there are things worth sacrificing maybe a sense of safety. I've had the FBI come and visit and tell me about death threats and rape threats against me since the book came out. But I feel that my sense of peace is not worth, not educating people about the totality and the urgency of this threat. And so it was very difficult. It was like, walking, I describe it in the book as walking through a room whose walls are made of burning glass, to spend every day over a year immersed in these really corrosive environments. And certainly, hatred of Jews is so endemic that I, was experiencing the sort of really toxic anti-Semitism and racism, immersing myself in it every day for, 2 years. And yeah, I think, would I do it again? Like, yes, I would, because it's worth it to understand the threat that we're facing and to help other people through the book, understand where we're at this moment in 2020. And, if I can warn one person, if I can convert one person towards standing up and fighting the white power movement wherever it rears its ugly head, then it was worth it, and I would do it again.
Talia, I know our producers are asking us to wrap it up, but I just have to ask you, just because it's such an interesting point that you make, and it sort of goes back to the earlier question that I asked you. Was there a part when Anne-Marie was talking about the psychological impact on doing something like this, was there a point where you realized that some of the things that you encountered had never gone away? In other words, if we talk to our grandparents or people who are much older than us, who may have experienced either National Socialism or racism in its most overt form, in the form of Jim Crow, they'll always say, yeah, things have gotten better at some level, but you never, ever let go of the fact that things can go pear-shaped very, very quickly because these things do not go away. In the case of Jewish people, this stuff has existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And did that realization that we really have not come as far as we sometimes think we have come sort of hit you like a ton of bricks? I mean, because I sometimes think that we're younger, we live in a country where we have access to information and we have access to things that our ancestors did not have access to. We have great jobs and we interact with people who are very diverse, and yet underneath all of that is that sort of that current that exists that if you just scratch below the surface, you uncover. Yeah,
I mean, speaking with you guys as, As Black people, myself as a Jew, I think we have, so much in common as religious minorities, as racial minorities. I would say yes, to encounter the fact that this prejudice that killed, my grandparents' families, and my mother lost a sister in the Holocaust, and to discover that these eliminationist prejudices are alive, while kicking and inspiring murder, as I'm writing a book. Certainly it was disheartening, especially, I grew up with the privilege of the hope of kind of the American dream, and that I would realize this, journey that my grandparents had taken over the sea after the war. I would say just that, hatred and scapegoating and fear, and the exploitation of fear are universal human drives. And we can see the ways that's linked to violence, straight from the 1898 Wilmington coup that led to a white supremacist absolute takeover of a multiracial Delaware town, right now to 2020. I mean, there's a straight line that these human elements are universal, the things that lead people to hate. But on the converse, the things that lead people to rise up, to be courageous, to speak from a space of solidarity, and to say, I will protect my community against these forces of hate, have also not attenuated, have also not gone away. And that's what brings me hope. That's what lets me wake up every morning, is to say, educating people is worth it, because I want to empower people to defend their communities against this rising threat. And so I hope that people come away from the book with the sense that at this moment, at this time in history, I have to put my skin in the game, put more on the line than just a yard sign, and stand up and impose a social cost on bigotry that perhaps has eroded over the past 5 years, to say that racism and organized racism are not acceptable in my community, in my town, and that's where it starts.
Talia Lavin, really fascinating discussion, and the book is called, hold it up again for us, we'll show it real quick.
It's called Culture
Warlords.
There you go.
It's like culture war, but they're, these are the people waging it behind the scenes, and it's available on Amazon, at your local bookstore, everywhere. So thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for spending some time with us.
I love the way that you sort of have turned the tables, that you received this sort of torrent of abuse, so much so that, you thought, I don't want to do this job anymore because I don't want to put a target on me the way I have. And then you have completely turned the tables, and you have empowered yourself, and through that book you're going to be empowering other people. So we really appreciate it. Thank
you so much. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm from a stiff-necked people. I'm a very stubborn person, and when I found the abyss looking so directly at me, I thought, well, I'm going to look right back at you, and write down everything I see and drag you out into the light. So that's the goal of the book. Your courage is inspiring, inspirational, nice. And I think it will hopefully do as you suggested, which is to give others hope. Talia, thank you so much. The book is called Cultural Warlords, My Journey into the Dark Web of White Supremacy. Thank you, Talia. Okay, thank you.